Hi everyone, this is Scott. For maps, references, and images for each episode, as well as links to all my social media, please go to ancientworldpodcast.com. And if you'd like to support the show, please go to patreon.com/theancientworld. Thanks again for listening. Decades of reign had nourished the rise of a dozen petty kingdoms before an Amorite king named Shamshi-Adad had greedily gobbled them up. The son of a ruler of a minor city, Shamshi-Adad had established himself by conquering the major sites of Ekalatum and Assur on the northern Tigris. Moving west, he'd easily swept through the nascent states of Upper Mesopotamia, only meeting substantial resistance approaching the lands of Mari. Anticipating its eventual fall, Shamshi-Adad raised a new capital in easy striking distance. The site he chose was actually ancient. In Akkadian times, it was known as Shekna, but most traces of that previous era were smothered in dirt and dust. On its refoundation around 1800 BC, Shekna was renamed Shubat-Enlil, the dwelling place of Enlil. It had remained the capital of Shamshi-Adad's territories, known as the Old Assyrian Empire, for the rest of his life. While the new capital was being laid out, the builders likely unearthed some structures from the previous Akkadian period. But a detailed study would have to wait another 3,800 years. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries AD, a team led by archaeologist Harvey Weiss excavated at Tel Leilan, the modern name of Shubat-Enlil. Remains from the last phase of Akkadian occupation, around 2200 BC, included an administrative building with unused clay balls for tablet manufacture and uninscribed clay tablets. Another building was left half-finished. The finds reflected a sudden departure by the former imperial overlords. And interestingly, most of the locals left with them. The decades after 2200 saw an 87% reduction in settled area, followed by the site's complete abandonment. Similar drops occurred at the nearby Akkadian administrative fortress city of Nagar, as well as at Hurrian Urkesh. Despite the Akkadians being involved, the signs didn't point to conflict. The reason for the abandonment was only revealed by studying the sediment between Akkadian-era Shekna and Amorite-era Shubat-Enlil. As Michael Marshall reports, between these settlements, Weiss and colleagues came across a buried layer of wind-blown silt so barren there was hardly even evidence of earthworms at work. Something drastic had happened, something that choked the land with dust for decades, even centuries, leaving a blanket of soil too inhospitable for even basic life. For roughly 300 years, starting around 2200 BC, much of Upper Mesopotamia became a virtual dead zone, a direct result of the 4.2 kiloyear BPE Aridification Event. There were exceptions, especially if you lived near a major river or other fresh water source. But for most people in most places, the region was practically unlivable. It was only in the century before Shamshi-Adad, starting around 1900 BC, that consistent rains returned. And after some assurance it wasn't a fluke, that people from adjacent lands decided to resettle the region. Upper Mesopotamia is a strong example, but as I mentioned last season, the scope of the Aridification event was much, much broader. As a minimum, it impacted all the regions from Anatolia to India and from the northern steppe to the Nile Valley that I'll be focusing on in this series. In fact, the latest research points to a global phenomenon. In this episode, I want to discuss the latest science behind the Aridification event, why and how it happened, and where and how its effects were felt. And I need to start by adopting a wider perspective, in terms of both time and space. So find yourself a comfortable chair, grab your favorite beverage, and settle in for a bit. The last global ice age ended around 9700 BC, giving birth to a new geological era called the Holocene epoch. Holocene is Greek for entirely new, so it doesn't mean much beyond that. And to insert yourself into the story, we are all currently, right now, still living in the Holocene epoch, which has lasted nearly 12,000 years and counting. Though we may have entered a brand new epoch called the Anthropocene around a century ago, marked by human effects on the global climate, but no official renaming quite yet. The current post-glacial Holocene epoch is divided into 3 ages. The first, Greenlandian age, ended around 6200 BC, when rapidly melting Canadian glaciers dumped massive amounts of cold water into the North Atlantic, leading to higher overall sea levels and a period of global cooling that lasted for roughly a century. With this glacial dump around 6200, we entered the second Northgrippian age of the current Holocene epoch. By around 5000 BC, glaciers stopped melting, sea levels stabilized, the world's great rivers finally settled down, and people started feeling a lot more comfortable setting up shop beside them. Everything I've covered in the series so far takes place during the Northgrippian age of the Holocene epoch, particularly in the post-5000 BC period. At this point, we need to broach a new subject, atmospheric science. I took a whole class in grad school once, so I'm pretty sure that makes me an expert. God, seriously, have patience with me with this next part. Actual scientists may want to cover their ears. Let's start with a little background from Weiss, which I'll go through very, very slowly. Moisture-laden North Atlantic cyclonic westerlies seasonally break through the Mediterranean trough and provide the winter precipitation needed for dry farming along the northern plains and mountain valleys of West Asia, as well as the spring melt that sustains both Euphrates floodplain agriculture in Syria and Tigris-Euphrates irrigation agriculture in southern Iraq. So, in the wintertime, North Atlantic-driven westerlies, i.e. coming from the west, surge through the Mediterranean to dump moisture on Western Asia. Another important weather system is what's called the Siberian High. This is a massive collection of cold, dry air that accumulates in the northeastern part of Eurasia from September through April, typically centered on Lake Baikal. So that's cold, dry air just sitting up there in the winter. Covering the North Pole is the polar vortex, a large region of cold, rotating air which generates a northern jet stream that typically hugs the edge of the vortex. In other words, remains at high latitudes. All right, so we've got the North Atlantic westerlies, the Siberian High, the polar vortex, and its jet stream, all of which are part of normal global weather patterns. Except around 2200 BC, something happened. We still don't know exactly what. We know that it wasn't another freshwater dump like in 6200 BC. We know that it wasn't a volcanic eruption, but something happened. The detailed explanation that follows is paraphrased from a 2019 paper by Weiss with colleagues Ariel Parsu and Monica Ionita. Around 2200 BC, something, possibly related to Earth's orbit, resulted in a greater difference than usual between the amount of sunlight hitting upper northern latitudes in the summertime versus in the wintertime, what the authors call an orbitally induced insolation gradient. This increased gradient led to a weakening of the polar vortex, which resulted in a wandering jet stream, one that strayed from its usual position near the edge of the vortex and promoted an early onset of winter in northeast Siberia. This resulted in decreased temperatures and an early and stronger Siberian high that expanded south and west, bringing cold, dry conditions across much of Eurasia. So, from the perspective of the Near East, we've got an unusual amount of cold, dry air coming down from the northeast in winter. But what about those nice, wet North Atlantic winter westerlies? Well, the same wandering jet stream from the weakened polar vortex also resulted in more sea ice in the North Atlantic, which, through a series of intermediate mechanisms, resulted in weaker North Atlantic westerlies. In fact, the resulting westerlies were likely too weak to overcome European high-pressure systems in order to penetrate through the Mediterranean trough, which meant that the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia were left at the mercy of the cold, dry air brought in by the stronger Siberian high. At the same time, circulation around the expanded Siberian high induced strong northerly winds in southern and western Asia. So, in addition to all the cold and dry, the region got much more windy, which means that a lot more dust is being picked up and deposited. All of which is crappy but fine if you're talking a one-off year. It becomes much more serious when these same conditions last a few years, a decade, or a generation. How many years of bitterly cold, windy winters with no rain, failed crops, and little animal fodder would reasonable people endure before deciding to move on? The answer varies, depending on each group's current situation, level of tolerance, and prospects for relocation. Which, long story short, is how you end up with sequential waves of refugees fleeing the affected region. A crescent-shaped swath of upper Mesopotamia that Aaron A. Burke calls the zone of uncertainty. Before we dive down the Amorite rabbit hole, let's stick with a global atmospheric perspective and cover another important set of weather systems: monsoons. Depending on how you break them down, there are 6 major regular global monsoons, the largest and most intense of which is the Indian monsoon. Like most monsoons, the Indian monsoon blows from southwest to northeast in summer, i.e. the summer monsoon, and the reverse direction in winter, the winter monsoon. Summer monsoons typically bring heavy rains, while winter monsoons bring cold, dry air. And studies suggest that the same event that impacted the Siberian high and North Atlantic westerlies also cooled the southern oceans, resulting in stronger and more frequent El Niño events that reduced water vapor formation and led to the weakening or even failure of the Indian summer monsoon. Which brings us to probably the world's most famous stalagmite, one growing from the floor of the Mamla cave in northeast India. Stalagmites are formed when mineral-rich water drips from a cave ceiling and the mineral deposits slowly accumulate. At this particular site, a perturbation in the isotopes of oxygen atoms present in one of the stalagmite layers correlates to a 20 to 30% decrease in Indian summer monsoon rainfall during a defined period. And when did this drop in rainfall start? You guessed it, right around 2200 BC. As it happens, the Mamla cave is located in the Indian state of Meghalaya, a Sanskrit word meaning the abode of clouds. And the growing evidence for the global impact of this sudden, colder, drier period led geologists to designate a brand new age of the current Holocene epoch, the so-called Meghalayan Age, with its start at 2200 BC, which again is the era that we're all still living in. And at least one reason this latest series is called The Ancient World Ages. Now, if we're talking the Indian subcontinent around 2200, we're talking the Indus Valley Civilization. And we will definitely be covering the effects of the Aridification event on that major regional culture. But we also need to talk about Egypt. To do that, we need to introduce another monsoon, the East African monsoon. So the Nile draws its water from two main sources. Around 20% comes from the relatively stable White Nile, with headwaters in Burundi and Rwanda. But fully 80% comes from the Blue Nile, which is fed by torrential rains each May through August in the Ethiopian highlands. In other words, by the East African summer monsoon. It's also the Blue Nile that contributes most of the rich, dark soil that allows Egyptian agriculture to thrive. The reason that Egypt was once called Kemet, the Black Land. Per a 2003 study, sediment cores from the Nile Delta show that Nile baseflow conditions changed considerably in the period between 2200 and 2000 BC, with a higher proportion of White Nile sediment compared to Blue Nile sediment. Per the authors, the decreased Blue Nile contribution resulted in a decrease in vegetative cover and an increase in erosion rate, accompanying the marked decline in rainfall. A separate study from 2018 shows that one major Blue Nile source, Lake Tana in Ethiopia, manifested a drier phase during this same period. A 2006 study reports that right next door in the northern Red Sea, sediment cores show a drastic change around 2200 BC. Including an absence of brine and a strong increase in surface salinity, reflecting a major evaporation event. On the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, in the Gulf of Oman, the authors note that sediment cores reflect a prominent dust spike due to increased dryness that lasted roughly 300 years. A 2018 study reports that a stalagmite in a cave in northern Iran, on the southern slopes of the Alborz Mountains, shows evidence of a period of increased dust flux from Mesopotamia, starting just before 2200 BC and lasting nearly 300 years. Moving east, we enter the territory of modern China, which experiences the effects of another monsoon called the East Asian monsoon. Studies have found a large reduction in the strength of the East Asian summer monsoon, beginning around 2200 BC and lasting for nearly 3 centuries. The weakened monsoon created a situation where the rain belt lingered at its southern position, resulting in increased precipitation in central China. The authors report that massive rainfall in the middle lower reaches of the Yangtze River Valley severely impacted the Liangshu culture, who were forced to abandon their capital and lands in the low-lying delta region. Similar flooding in the middle reaches of the Yellow River challenged the local Longshan culture. In fact, the later story of Great Yu controlling the waters by managing floods on the Yellow River may stem from distant memories of this regional event. Farther north, in Inner Mongolia, beyond the range of the weakened monsoon, sediment cores from a local lake show a period of increased dryness, again starting around 2200 BC and lasting 300 years. Across the Pacific and British Columbia, glaciers advanced in concert with the event, driven by cooler summer temperatures, higher winter precipitation, or both. A stalagmite in a cave in West Virginia shows a change in the isotopes of oxygen atoms, while Iceland also experienced a glacial advance. Increased aridity during the same period caused settlement abandonment in southwestern Spain and triggered the emergence of a new culture in southeastern Spain, one that built dozens of motillas in local floodplains to extract the groundwater needed to grow wheat and barley. I suspect you get the general drift, but let me just quote Weiss. Within current levels of resolution, the abrupt alterations of climate and settlement in the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia between 2200 and 1900 BC are synchronous, and the effects extend to Central Asia, South Asia, East Asia, Australia, North America, South America, and the Antarctic. Which leaves us with the tantalizing question of just what the heck may have caused it. A question that may eventually be answered with better models or larger sets of data. If there even was an actual trigger. Per Marshall, if we never find a smoking gun, then the 4.2 kiloyear BPE Aridification Event becomes the largest unforced global event we know of, and a disquieting example of what Earth's climate may just sometimes do on its own. Which I feel is a pretty good time for a contemplative break.
Vitamin Water Zero Sugar has great taste, zero BS, and obviously zero sugar. For those with zero room in their calendar, zero patience for slow walkers, those who get 0 hours of sleep on a Saturday night, have zero filter, zero given, and zero interest in grabbing a plain, boring water. Grab a delicious Vitamin Water Zero Sugar today.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
Now that we've got the big picture, let's return to Upper Mesopotamia. We started this episode discussing the cities of Shubat Enlil, or Shekna, Urkesh, and Nagar. In 2200 BC, these were some of the largest cities in the Jazira region, between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Why weren't they closer to one or the other so they could use it to irrigate their crops? That's a good question. Per Weiss, as they descend from the Anatolian plateau, the upper courses of both rivers cut deep riverbeds. They only approach the level of the plains and become suitable for irrigation agriculture farther south. Up north, the cities practiced lowland dry farming, which was entirely dependent on rain. Once the aridification event set in, rainfall decreased between 30 and 50%, making farming at these cities next to impossible. We discussed the case of Shubat Enlil, so let's take a closer look at Hurrian Urkesh. Last episode, we discussed how the Akkadian king Naram Sin gave the ruler of Urkesh two gifts. The first was nominal control of the city of Nagar, making him king of Urkesh and Nagar, even though Nagar was technically a fortified Akkadian administrative center. The second was the hand of his daughter Taram Agade in marriage to an Urkesh prince. To make her more comfortable in her northern transition, the rulers of Urkesh, the Endon Tupkish and his wife Uknitum, built the city's first royal palace. The most compelling evidence documenting this era is impressions from Urkesh royal seals. Per Giorgio Buccolati and Marilyn Kelly Buccolati, a seal of Tupkish shows him seated before a star and a deity with a lion reclining at the foot of his throne. The crown prince, likely Taram Agade's husband, stands on the lion's head with his hand on the lap of the king. A seal of Queen Uknitum shows her with a distinctive braided hairstyle flourished with an ornament. A small girl with the same hairstyle and ornament touches her lap. From these and similar examples, the authors propose a preoccupation with dynastic continuity. possibly in reaction to recent Akkadian imperial domination. Another seal impression identifies its owner as Tarim Agade, likely after she became the Urkesh queen. Her inscription's flanked by Akkadian imagery, a bullman fighting a lion on one side and a nude hero fighting a water buffalo on the other. Another seal impression of Ishar Kinum Endan of Urkesh likely belonged to her son and successor, who was also Naram Sin's grandson. Assuming Tarim Agade came to the throne at about the same time as her brother Sharkali Shari, she and her son would have ruled Urkesh as the Aridification Event set in. Per Weiss, in the first few decades of the event, the Akkadian-era palace at Urkesh was completely abandoned, along with the entire 100-hectare lower town, though parts of the Acropolis remained occupied. At Nagar, both the Acropolis and the lower town were suddenly abandoned, even as a new grain storeroom was still under construction. In subsequent decades, Akkadian remains were gradually overlaid by a series of smaller settlements, mainly private houses and graves. With its temple to the chief Hurrian god Kumarbi and the mysterious underground Abi structure, Urkesh may have kept a limited role as a regional cult center. But the fate of the Endan Ishar Kinum is unknown. Though the palace was abandoned, he may have remained to perform cultic duties from a much more modest dwelling. Or, like the vast majority of the population, he may have left the city or region entirely. The experience of these northern cities is a microcosm of what happened all along Burke's zone of uncertainty, a crescent stretching from the Zagros foothills across upper Mesopotamia into Syria and right on down into Canaan. As the rain decreased and stayed decreased, the crisis grew drastically worse. A substantial portion of those affected were local Amorite pastoralists, no longer able to sustain their flocks or sell their wool to the rapidly disappearing regional centers. Which is why, in the first few decades of the event, family by family, clan by clan, tribe by tribe, village by village, they pulled up stakes to head for greener pastures. What do we know about where they went? Well, Burke raises an interesting point. We often try to trace Amorite migration by looking for evidence of pastoralism, or search for where they may have gone by looking at regions that are still suited to pastoralism, on the assumption that any migrating Amorites would have kept their same vocation, which was certainly true in some cases. But basically, we're talking about refugees. And like refugees in any time and place, they're also going to do their best to adapt, fit in, and in particular, take advantage of any available opportunities to help their families survive. Even if it means picking up a sword or shovel in the service of some local ruler. So we're not just looking for pasture land. We're looking for anywhere refugees might find subsistence or, even better, gainful employment. If aridification provided the push, existing social and kinship networks were the pull. Per Burke, one prominent framework was chain migration, where members of a social group who establish themselves in a particular region serve as anchors to facilitate the migration and resettlement of other members. This was especially true if the new location had a welcoming, or at least non-hostile, culture, sufficient resources, and a need for surplus labor. So, with that framework in mind, let's look at a few of the options. The Upper Tigris region was home to major cities like Urbilum, Assur, and Nineveh. This region may have been particularly appealing to Hurrian refugees, based on their long-standing cultural ties. For Hurrians living near Urkesh and Nagar, there was also the option to migrate north into the Armenian highlands, the ancestral lands of their Kura Araxes forebears. Though they'd have to be careful not to go too far, lest they come into conflict with the current residents, the militant Kurgan cultures of the northern steppe, whom I covered in a Patreon mini-episode. Further west, approaching the Euphrates, we're typically talking about Amorites. In this region, per Burke, settlements between Mari and Emar experienced considerable growth after 2200 BC, at least partly due to Mari's long stable line of Shakanaku rulers. Conversely, settlements between Emar and Carchemish and along both sides of the Euphrates Bend were largely abandoned. Of course, both the Tigris and Euphrates led all the way down to wealthy, productive, and densely populated central and southern Mesopotamia, which may have been an appealing option for migrants with family or tribal connections, or those just willing to try their luck. We know that enough eventually did for rulers to build a series of border walls to better control their movements. It's worth mentioning that decreased northern rainfall was also reducing Tigris and Euphrates flow, with agricultural impacts on southern Mesopotamia that are still a bit hard to quantify. But yeah, in general, rivers were good, and the best kinds of rivers were those not as dependent on rainfall, but instead fed by springs, via underground formations called karsts. And as it happened, west of the Euphrates was a major karst-fed river called the Orontes. Unsurprisingly, this river became a major draw for Amorite refugees. And at some point, the local, mostly Amorite rulers also built a border wall to better control their movements. Just off the Orontes, and not too far from our old friend Emesa, was a settlement called Qatna, spelled Qatna. The settlement sat atop a limestone plateau in a region crossed by several Orontes tributaries. Qatna had 3 karstic springs, and at some point after 2200, the springs were dammed to create a large freshwater lake. Initially a settlement of 25 hectares, Qatna quickly grew to 5 times that size, at least partly fueled by Amorite refugees. As Burke notes, over time, formerly displaced groups constituted a substantial social element within the power dynamics of such nascent states. Qatna itself was soon the heart of a major Amorite kingdom. Off to the northwest lay the former regional powerhouse of Ebla, recently destroyed by Naram-Sin. In the period after 2200, Amorite refugees may have squatted, then refounded a smaller version of the city. Further northwest, near the Kuwait River, Amorites settled a site called Halab, modern Aleppo, which eventually became the capital of the Amorite kingdom of Yamkhad. Toward the coast, settlements also grew up on the shores of Makht Lake, as well as near the spring-fed site of Arka in Lebanon. At the same time, regions lacking freshwater sources, including established coastal sites like Byblos and Ugarit, experienced significant declines. But it was nothing compared to the situation in Canaan. I released a few Patreon mini-episodes covering the history of Canaan between around 9000 BC and 2500 BC. For those who aren't subscribers, the period around 3100 BC saw the emergence of a small set of fortified urban centers at Jericho, Megiddo, and En-Esur that engaged in trade with Egypt, the cities of the Syrian coast, and beyond. But around 2500 BC, the urban population in the southern Levant underwent a radical decline, with most of the population resuming a much more rural lifestyle. This was likely due to factors such as increasing conflicts between local elites, declining Egyptian trade, increasing pharaonic invasions, and migration south toward a copper corridor supporting Egyptian demand. When the event kicked in around 2200, and Egypt stopped building large stone monuments requiring copper tools, the South Levantine copper economy collapsed. The region also felt the squeeze of both increased aridity, with the Dead Sea dropping by a full 45 meters, and the loss of maritime and overland trade. Just like up north, the locals came to the realization that their current position was untenable, and they needed to move to somewhere they could actually survive. To Canaanites, that meant Egypt. The last Old Kingdom dynasty, the sixth, had a term they used when referring to Semitic-speaking Asiatics, Amu, apostrophe A-M-U, a term that likely derived from the Amorite Amu, apostrophe A-M-M-U. Per Burke, Amu should be treated as a collective term for Semites from Asia, including groups of Amorites. This mirrors the Sumerian use of the term Martu, which constituted a collective identity composed of distinct tribes. So, without putting too fine a point on it, a similar label was being used to define the members of refugee groups entering both Sumer and Egypt. And just like in Sumer and northern Syria, the Egyptians eventually built a wall. Actually, in their case, it was a string of fortifications to better control their movements. I want to wrap things up this episode by giving a sense of scale. Per Burke, the most precipitous decline in settlement after the onset of the Aridification Event appears to have occurred across northern Mesopotamia, centering on the Jazira. Again, the region of Urkesh, Nagar, and Shubat Enlil. In this region alone, settlement among sites of more than 5 hectares, which had nearly reached 1,100 combined hectares in total settled area, declined to less than 60 hectares in total settled area. Using an average estimate of 100 people per hectare in these settlements, this represents a decline from more than 110,000 inhabitants to as few as 6,000, a decrease of 95%. Across the entirety of the zone of uncertainty, estimates range between several 100,000 and 500,000 inhabitants put to flight. It was, per Burke, an exodus of unprecedented proportions, and among the world's earliest evidence for mass refugee migration. On the Aridification event itself, I'll give the last word to Weiss. Before its global expression was known, and before its abruptness, magnitude, and duration had been defined, if only approximately, the case for the 4.2 kiloyear BPE Aridification event and linked dry farming collapses and habitat tracking was sometimes criticized as a climate determinism argument, one that erroneously imputed causal force to climate change while ignoring the social forces that must have been involved in, for example, the Akkadian or Old Kingdom collapses. For the most part, such arguments dissolve against the highly resolved dating of the event, its abruptness and magnitude, and its synchronism with transregional societal collapses, regional abandonments, and habitat tracking. Long story short, my friends, it was all about the climate change. I hope this background was helpful and interesting, and gave some insight into my personal fascination with the Aridification event and its global game-changing nature. Next episode, we'll pick things up right where we left off. It's 2200 BC, and Shar-Kali Shari, the heroic god of Akkad, is still in control of his sprawling Akkadian empire. And I'm just going to say you might want to enjoy it while it lasts. Would you like to listen to ad-free episodes of The Ancient World and a bunch of other great history podcasts? Then go to The Ancient World Podcast on Apple Podcasts and subscribe to Airwave History Plus. You'll get a free 7-day trial to listen to ad-free episodes, bonus content, and more from the largest collection of history podcasts anywhere. So subscribe to Airwave History Plus on Apple Podcasts today.